Welcome to the opening session of Movement 2, Vibrations in the Present. Here, we're going to speak of those who today are rethinking fundamental societal relationships, those with nature, technology, future, and ourselves. This session is about engaging with those who are proactively exploring alternative models of development right here, right now, proposing new relationships with nature, technology, and the economy. The question we want to explore is, what does it take to achieve systemic change? You will hear from Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, Kate Raworth, the renowned author of Donut Economics, Daniel Gomez Gaviria from the Planning Department in Colombia, and Martin Burt from the Path-Breaking Poverty Spotlight Initiative in Paraguay. At UNDP, we have learned a lot about path-breaking work during the COVID-19 pandemic. From digital enrollment campaigns to e-payment systems, to temporary basic incomes, to gender policy trackers and green recovery portfolios, the COVID response condensed a lot of effort and innovation into a very short period of time. Will we wait decades for the dozens of social, economic, and environmental gaps to solve themselves? The answer is no. We're compressing time and addressing issues of the future in the present. A wonderful reminder of this approach is described in the latest Human Development Report on the Anthropocene. The planetary adjusted HDI gives us a glimpse of the future, how countries would be ranked if the Paris Agreement holds, if the SDG agenda is fulfilled. And the message is very sobering. No country in the world raises human development standards and achieves net zero emissions and lower material footprint just yet. This means we have our work cut out for ourselves, and most of the challenge is not merely technical. It is political, it is distributive, behavioral, and institutional. So it involves the hard bits of development. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. So first off, we have Kate Raworth, the author of Donut Economics and lead of Action Deal. The reason that we're with her is that she can bring an innovative angle on planetary boundaries and social boundaries in thinking about redesigning societies. We're also with Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And what she has done with her Transform Freetown development plan is to rethink the way big missions need to be tackled to increase vegetation, for example, or reducing exposure to various disaster and health risks. Our third guest is Daniel Gomez Gaviria, the Deputy Director of the National Planning Department in Colombia. And Colombia has been at the forefront of the extension of a very innovative cash transfer program during the COVID crisis. So we'll talk to him about that. And finally, Martin Burt, the CEO of Poverty Spotlight, also a transformative initiative in Paraguay that focuses on subjective poverty and ways to self-diagnose and eliminate multidimensional poverty in urban and rural areas. Thank you all. So let's turn to Kate. Kate, cities rushed to donut economics in the middle of the COVID crisis last spring, from Amsterdam to Portland, from Copenhagen to Philadelphia. We wanted to ask you, what are some of the factors that characterize cities that create favorable conditions for transforming economic systems in the middle of a global emergency? What has your team learned about the model from looking at the experience of these cities and engaging with them?
So there has indeed been a lot of interest in donut economics in the midst of the COVID crisis, but I think it's really important not to let it turn into a story that actually didn't happen. So I want to be very clear that the cities of Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia were already working a lot with creating the Donut City portrait long before any of us had heard of COVID. And in fact, I think the work in Portland and Philadelphia got stopped in good part because of the COVID crisis. It was the city of Amsterdam that decided that despite COVID, and partly also driven by it, they went ahead and published the city portrait that we had created in 2019. They published it in April 2020, and they did publish it in the month in which their city had the highest rate of COVID infection. So they very intentionally decided to go on having a long view and a big vision in the middle of crisis. And as the Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam, Marieke van Doornink, has said, in the middle of crisis, perhaps this is when we most need to see the light, when we are in the darkness of that crisis. So they already knew as a city that they wanted to transform the energy system, that they wanted to create a circular economy, that they wanted to do this in a way that's socially just. And I think when Amsterdam came across the model of the donut, they saw that this was a framework that brought together many different things they already wanted to do under one holistic framework. And I believe that is one of the very strong reasons why they decided to adopt it. So they have been a pioneer, going public with it and showing that it embodies what they already needed to make happen in the city. And I'll add, sorry, at the same time, when Amsterdam published their city portrait in April 2020, and it was covered in the press internationally, that then triggered a whole new group of cities that we had had no contact with until that point to be interested, from Copenhagen to Nanaimo in Canada to Brussels and many other cities that we are now talking to. So I think other cities were inspired by Amsterdam. And at Donut Economics Action Lab, we think peer-to-peer inspiration is one of the most powerful ways in which change starts to happen. So other cities were inspired by Amsterdam's lead, and they said, we want to explore what it would mean to put this vision at the heart of our city at this moment of crisis, when we're searching for a long, big vision for the future. Shall we adopt the donut?
Thank you for those insights. The donut model is evidently about, among other things, creating the conditions for a city or a nation to renew its understanding of what economic success looks like. What, in your experience, are the most effective levers to generate that reframing? And are they different in the Global South?
So I'm going to start with the cities of the Global North, which is where we've begun this work. And I'm thinking now of the cities that are coming to us, having been inspired by Amsterdam. What is it that I'm seeing as a pattern across those cities? What I'm seeing is leadership. I'm seeing change makers in positions of influence in their city governments, bringing along other city councillors, other city politicians, and saying, let's have the guts, the ambition, and the conviction to drive for something bigger. Let's have a vision. And that leadership is key. Without it, this won't happen. So it begins actually as a mind shift change, a desire to create a city that is thriving, not just in terms of being a good life for people locally, but recognizing that that city has an impact on the whole planet, ecologically and socially. And finally saying, let's recognize our impacts worldwide. Let's make them visible. Let's make ourselves accountable for them. And let's begin to take this into account as part of our policy. So that's what I'm seeing. Ambitious change makers in city government who have a vision. I'll add also that the places where I think it's really going to have traction is where there are change makers, not only in the city government, but also in the community, where individuals who are working in community networks, social enterprise, in the universities, in NGOs, in civic spaces, they've actually also spontaneously said, well, we want to use the donut in our work, and we're going to create a donut coalition here, or bring it into an existing coalition, so that we can then engage with the city government as they start using this as a tool. And so that combination of city administration leadership with civic society, bringing in a new tool, holding each other accountable for that tool, and recognizing that it can be implemented in many, many different ways at many different scales within the city, that is where I'm seeing it have real traction. Now, you ask about the Global South. First of all, we've begun this work in the cities of the Global North, working with C40 cities and circular economy, because we believe that these are the cities that have the obligation and the responsibility to move first and fastest in reducing their impact on the planet. But there is interest as well in the Global South, from Costa Rica to Bangladesh to Colombia to Curacao. And we're about to start working on creating a new methodology of the city portrait, working with partners in the Global South to ensure that it's adapted to their needs and interests. So I can't yet say clearly, because we've only just begun this work, but what I'm seeing again is the same pattern. It's change makers, both based in government or in civic society, who say, we already know there are changes we need to bring about, and we find this a useful framework. And so we want to bring it here and make it relevant where we are.
Now, we are often caught in a difficult transition between a powerful, provocative framework like the donut and its implementation in the real world. So you set up the Donut Action Lab precisely to bridge this gap, and you've been inundated with requests. What are you learning about system transformation as you're moving from research to action?
So I wrote Donut Economics as the book that I wish I could have read when I was a student studying economics, bringing together all the ideas that I was never taught. And I'm delighted, obviously, by the traction and interest that it's had internationally. But when it really started coming to life for me, it was when, after giving a talk, people would come up to me and say, actually, I'm teaching this in the classroom, or I'm bringing this into my council, my town, my city, or I'm bringing this into my business. And it was clear that this idea did want to move from being an idea on the page to work and practice in action. That's why we set up Donut Economics Action Lab. We are in very, very early days of doing this. I want to be really clear. So it's like we're still going around the first lap of the running track. I can't share deep practiced learning because it's just at the beginning stages. And every day our team learn new things from community groups or city governments or businesses or teachers who have done something completely brilliant and surprising that we would never have thought of. That for us is the excitement of allowing an idea to spread this way. So at the heart of our work is the principle that we have never once asked anybody to use the donut, to talk about it, to put it into practice, to share it, to recommend it, never. All of the interest is because change makers, wherever they are, have seen it and said to themselves, I think this could be useful for what we're doing here. And so we've created a tool that we've put in the Creative Commons. All of our tools and videos are open to anybody to use, and they can adapt them. That's the openness with which we have set up Donut Economics Action Lab. And I think that openness, together with peer-to-peer inspiration, is one of the reasons why it's spreading fast and with real energy. But at the same time as openness, we have to put in place conditions of integrity. We need to make sure that as the concept spreads, it doesn't unintentionally get changed and misunderstood, or intentionally get co-opted and watered down and turned into something that loses its transformative potential. And particularly in the space of business, we have put in place very clear guidelines for how and when businesses can engage with the donut. But we also are asking any community group that's setting up using it, or city government, to follow a set of principles of practice, that if you want to put the donut into practice, then you need to follow the very principles that it stands for. So we're still exploring this balance between openness and integrity. But again, I'll say it last time because I really believe it profoundly, the combination of peer-to-peer inspiration, mayors inspire mayors, community groups inspire community groups, teachers inspire teachers, businesses inspire businesses. The combination of that, together with the openness of making tools available and open to adaptation to make it relevant and useful in your own context, is clearly a powerful and fast way to allow ideas to spread and scale.
So we often focus on public policy, but what does the donut mean for the business sector? And how do businesses create a reframing for the economic system in a city?
So we welcome businesses to engage with the concept of the donut. And in fact, on our platform, there's a tool about when business meets the donut, but at the moment, it is a tool for internal reflection for that company. So it's something that companies should take inside their boardroom, inside their offices, and discuss internally. But we also say we don't want companies now to use it as a branding tool in public communications. There's a lot of internal reflection that needs to happen in many, many companies. Business can clearly be a powerful vehicle for creating social and ecological change. But we believe that business itself needs to be designed to enable it to play that role. And much 20th century business was designed around the idea of capturing and extracting as much financial value as possible for the owners of the company. That will not create the regenerative and distributive societies we need. So we need to look deep into the design of business itself, the purpose of the company, how it networks with its customers and suppliers, how it's governed, but crucially, how it is owned and therefore how it's financed and what finance demands. These are the deep design traits of business that we believe need to be redesigned to make business in service to meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet.
And finally, Kate, you know UNDP very well. Where should an organization like ours look to unlock future development paths and accelerate efforts like those we saw with a cohort of cities taking on the donut model?
So I know UNDP well because 20 years ago, I was a member of the Human Development Report Office writing chapters of the Human Development Reports. But let me be clear, that was 20 years ago and in a very specific part of UNDP. So I also want to be humble about my knowledge of UNDP today. What I can say from where I'm sitting is two things. One, There are change makers everywhere, in every town, city, rural area, nation, business, community. If it's possible to support them and find them and empower them and enable them to do the work they already know needs to happen, to me, that is the most powerful way of enabling change, because it's in the hands and the motivation of people embedded in that context. And they are the ones who know how to turn the tools, the ideas into relevant practice where they are based. So follow local knowledge and leadership. And secondly, now that I'm working in a small organization and we're seeking funding from foundations, I've become very aware of the power dynamics between funders and grant receivers. And it's really important that that relationship be examined between those who have the money and those who are implementing the work, or who are receiving, so-called traditional beneficiaries. That needs to be re-explored, and those relationships need to be remade. And there are funding bodies who are really aware of the power dynamic that it brings when you bring money, and are very keen to transform it. But I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had and turned into new practice across the field of international development.
Yvonne, you've run a mayoral race in the promise of raising property taxes, and the Transform Freetown plan sets ambitious transformative targets that by their nature can't be achieved within a single electoral term. Since pure political survival doesn't seem to be driving force behind your platform, what is, and how did you make choices on what missions to focus on the plan?
Right. So thanks very much. Yes, pure political survival is absolutely not the objective. And the fact that I'm not a career politician, came in from the private sector, probably gives a little bit of a hint to that. So for me, politics is a means to an end, not an end in itself. It's a means to bring about change. And the change that I'm seeking to effect here is one which speaks to how we save our planet, the issues around climate change, which for me, the initial triggers were sanitation disaster and environmental disasters. And when I say sanitation disasters, living in a city where you literally had mounds of waste and no structure, no system for dealing with that waste. So it was dealing with those issues that led me to run for mayor. And in defining what I would do as a mayor, it was solving those problems, which was in the forefront. But in the process of solving those problems, in the process of articulating a solution, and not certainly doing it on my own, but really doing with engagement of residents, technical experts, private sector, MDU, really bringing everyone to the table over a period of months, identifying what the challenges were. It was that process that really reinforced that no solution can be found in a silo. And so Transform Freetown, which you mentioned, has the 4 clusters and 11 priority sectors, 19 specific targets. The achievement of those targets is what we know will make the impact. So it's achievement of targets in sectors from education to urban mobility, sanitation, environmental management, urban planning and housing, revenue mobilization, health. It's the whole picture. Now, that's not the whole 11, but I'll just stop there. It's the whole picture. So how do you prioritize? How do you focus? We looked at what was burning. Kind of like, you have a fire, what have you got to grab first to help put the fire out? So in the first year of Transform Freetown, we had a strong emphasis on sanitation. It's very hard to talk about transformation in a context where there's filth everywhere. Even clearing your mind, needs for you to have a cleaner space, but also the health impacts, the water impacts were undeniable. And of course, from an environmental perspective, this is a city that had tackled and had to deal with flooding for a number of years. So the work we did on flood mitigation was immediate. Literally, it was the first thing that I did coming into the office. Our work on tree planting, Freetown the Tree Town, planting 1 million trees. These are all really critical. Drainage construction. I've just come which is why I was a bit sort of breathless. I've just come from a community where there was a terrible fire. 46 households were affected, over almost 500 people, because they're big households. But it's an unplanned development, what you'd call a slum on the hillsides. And they were saying to me, "Oh, Mayor, we have no water, we have no roads." And my response is, that's why we need urban planning. That's why you always hear the mayor saying it's critical that we have devolution of the functions of urban planning and building permit issuance. These are functions which in pretty much most cities in the world, certainly in the West, these are functions which are devolved to municipalities, to the local councils. But here it's devolved in law, a law established in 2004, the Local Government Act of 2004, but it is still not devolved. It's still held by the ministry. Consequence is no planning. And disasters because you have, 40 properties clustered together in a place where there's no access. The fire force could only come so far and couldn't get to them. And you've got poor housing conditions, which exacerbate poor health conditions, poor sanitation. There's no access even for a small tricycle to go up to that community that has thousands of people. So when you talk about prioritization, it's from the perspective of what really have we got to tackle first, recognizing you tackle nothing alone. You've got to have this multi-layered approach, but also a recognition of what can you actually do. When we're doing our, we did a prioritization in order to arrive at the targets. In setting those targets, we had on the one axis, what's the impact? On the other axis, what's the likelihood of us being able to do it? And being able to do it meant you've got the mandates, you can access the funding. So it was also a question of pragmatism, so you prioritize what you can practically get done. I often say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You've got a problem and it's huge. You can't, you'll be overwhelmed if you think you're going to fix everything together. But what you decide to bite, in terms of that elephant, is a bit that you can chew, something you can actually get your hands around, and something you can actually solve, because it's in solving the smaller aspects of the problem that you build confidence and a sense of hope. Our property rate notices, eventually, after the suspension from government last year, eventually we started delivering them last week. I've just been down in the banking hall and it's full. Our biggest problem now is that the banks aren't taking the money fast enough and people are queuing and sitting for too long. And that's the problem we've got to solve, because people get fed up of having to do that, and we are working on it. But it goes to show that when communities see results, when communities see that you're actually delivering services, there's the restoration of the social contract between the city and the residents begins.
Thank you so much for that. We know that investing in transformation is hard under any circumstances. You've only doubled down on this agenda in the middle of the COVID crisis. So what pre-existing fragilities in Freetown has the pandemic exposed, and how have you dealt with those?
Okay, so in doubling down, as you put it, I think I'm going to reference an expression which is used very, very often in respect of COVID and the recovery. People talk about the recovery, whether it's the green just recovery, which, we really promote as C40 cities. I was on that mayoral task force that, sort of worked out how we wanted to see the recovery. But we use the expression recovery a lot, and it doesn't, in our context, it's not so much about a recovery, because recovery implies that you were somewhere and you had a glitch and now you're just trying to get back on where you were. We were not where we needed to be. So this is a question of accelerating growth, moving along a trajectory of development that we were just not far enough along. So doubling down on COVID is not so much during COVID, it's not so much you double down because there was COVID. It's linked with the second half of your question. What are the things that COVID shone a spotlight on? When you're told, wash your hands and you have no water in the middle of a crisis, that is a problem. So we had water as a target. Our target in Transform Freetown is to ensure that we moved from 47% of residents not having access to water to 75% having access. That was the target that we had set pre-COVID. COVID just made it more urgent, because it was clear that you needed to get access to water to people fast. or else they wouldn't be able to wash their hands. You couldn't just leave it to them to solve it until you got round to it. You needed to really come alongside and support. And that's why we were able to get 160 rainwater harvesting systems installed in informal settlements. And we are also fast tracking work we're doing with UNCDF and Blue Peace with Swiss Development Corporation to have 40 water kiosks and 25 public toilets installed around the city. So the fact that I'm talking about rainwater harvesting systems and the fact that I'm talking about water kiosks, boreholes, already tells you that our conversation is very different to the conversation that's been going on in Istanbul. You're not going to be talking about rainwater harvesting systems because there's water in the taps. And this is one of the things which I think as we look at COVID, this pandemic, how it's being dealt with across the world, what next, climate change, and the fact that that as an emergency has not gone away, it's really important that we contextualize. But in contextualizing, we realize that there's no complacency, because this pandemic has shown us, perhaps like no other, that the phrase of the SDGs, leave no one behind, it's not an option, it's an imperative. Because for as long as there's still COVID in my city, there's still a risk of COVID in your city. And so we all need to get on board. And what does that mean in practical terms? It means that we're leveraging. It means that financial obstacles to the basics are overcome. It means that the inequalities that we've seen exacerbating, increasing, both amongst nations, between nations, and within nations, it means that we've really got to be serious about addressing these. It means that lip service has got to stop and real action has got to start. You know, I was reading something the other day about the percentage of recovery funds which have gone into supporting fossil fuel companies. We're not going to win this battle. Climate, COVID, pandemics, development, the challenges of inequality, we're not going to win these battles with lip service. We really have to make the changes that we want to see, because everything that happens now in any parts of the world is impacting the rest.
And finally, Yvonne, from 2.5 years of experience as a mayor and the recent Transform Freetown second report on the implementation of the plan, what have you learned about transforming systems? And what advice might you have for an organization like UNDP in terms of unlocking radically different development paths with our partners?
Okay, I would definitely say that the expression, I think it's an expression, not a proverb, you go further together, is absolutely true. In tackling the challenges of our city, it was clear to me from the first day, there was no way we could do this on our own. We didn't have the revenue base. You know, the per capita revenue in the city when I came into office was $1.25. That's literally $1.25 per person for everything we're supposed to do in the city. Not happening. And when you have a really ambitious target, you could end up not having that target if you are constraining yourself to what you can access. The only way you can do it is by opening the doors, and that's opening the doors not just to money, but to ideas. You know, you're not going to have all the solutions. What you can have, you can be able, and even with, it's really useful to get other people on the table. So how did we do it? Very practically. My sort of nerdy approach to life means that when I was campaigning, I read the Local Government Act cover to cover, and I looked through the schedule of everything that was devolved to me, and I thought through, well, what are the challenges here? And I did this whole PowerPoint presentation, which then became my campaign, my campaign brochure. And I was shocked because I hadn't realized that, you know, sort of so much of what was in the act was actually in reality not devolved, so that I was going to hit these challenges around what I said I could do versus what I'm being allowed to do. But it's advocacy, right? So we're not going to let go. The law says this is my function, and we clearly need it to be my function, or the city's function. Let's not personalize things. So let's keep going with that. Let's keep going on pushing that. But the concept of having the views of others is probably just, I don't know. I mean, it's just something that I think I've just always known through work experience, through charity work, maybe it's just where I've been brought up. I know that you do more when others do it with you. So we engaged our residents in the first 3 months. So July, I came in office in May. From August, September, July, August, September, we engaged 15,000 residents in focus groups in the city. Then we put a call out. We invited all the NGOs, the UNDPs, everybody to my office in different settings. We had one for development partners, for the embassies, etc., one for the NGOs who are using donor money to implement one themselves, the funders, international as well as local NGOs. We did the same with private sector. And then we basically shared the vision, as in these are the sectors, and the vision is that we work together to create a solution. So we didn't come and say, this is what we were going to do. And maybe that's something that, UNDP, other agencies, it'd be beneficial to learn from. I mean, I'm representing the city. I was voted for by the residents of the city to deliver change for them. I didn't sit in a corner and say, this is what change looks like. And sometimes we have that challenge with development partners sitting in a room somewhere, coming out and saying, this is our strategy for the next 5 years. And like, really interesting. So we had them not just opened up for each sector. We invited people to become part of technical working groups, and anybody could join. You just had to commit your time. We shared research documents on the subject. We had different settings. We had initial sessions where the idea was, let's discuss what's the problem. Let's all be clear, articulate what the problem is. Then we had sessions which were a theory of change. What's the biggest thing? What is it we can do that would have the most impact? Okay, what's the target? And these were interactive, these were collaborative, wide section of people. And then we tested it and we validated, and then we published. We had, in that process, so many parties involved in articulating where we're going to go that we got buy-in. I mean, there are people from the diaspora, Sierra Leoneans, who flew in because they're really interested in, for example, urban mobility. And that one, I'm thinking of one particular person who then actually moved to Freetown to be a part of working that through. Donors like EU, DFID, who were really, FCDO, who were really involved with the sanitation piece. They followed this journey. And so we problem solve together, so when they are then designing their programs, they're designing the programs knowing that Transform Freetown is the framework that everyone in the city is working to. And what can be sometimes less optimal is when partners, for a variety of reasons, sort of maintain or seek to maintain an independence from those who they're to serve, those who they're here to partner with. And there are many reasons for this, and we won't go into it because that's a subject for another day. But what the outcome of this is suboptimality, and very many times a lack of sustainability, because things can end up not being owned. There is a tendency, I feel, if you work in a silo, to be totally limited in what you choose to do, how you do it, and what the results are, which can be, I mean, we have had solutions coming out of the woodwork because we've simply said, our doors are open, everybody can come on board. Everybody's part of Transform Town. You have an idea, come share it. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. One thing we are very clear about, though, is we don't jump all over the shop. Now that we've articulated our 19 targets, those are the targets we work to. So you may have a fantastic idea, but if it's not aligned with Transform Freetown, even if it's brilliant, we are resource constrained. So we make sure we keep our resources on the things that we have decided to do. It doesn't mean that what you're wanting to do isn't great. It just means that we haven't committed to do it. And what we've committed to, what we have declared, what we have announced, we're very transparent. You just mentioned the second year report. What we're going to be judged on, is where we're going to put the attention. We went through a process of deciding to do these particular 19 targets. we want to just honor that process and finish that. You say you're right, it's not going to be done in a term, but that's okay. I'm not expecting that we're going to score 100%, but the very fact that we're doing it, whether we score 50%, 60%, 80%, the very fact that we're doing it is already making a change.
So welcome, Danielle. In response to COVID last year, you led an unprecedented expansion of Colombia's social welfare program, onboarding thousands of newly needy households, including those hardest to reach, without bank accounts or operating in the informal sector. Could you tell us more about those efforts?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me to Istanbul Innovation Days. It's a pleasure to be here and to share the experience of Colombia and the entire government team in building these efforts and these responses last year. So in particular on social programs, when the pandemic came along, we thought back to the last crisis that we had in Colombia. Colombia has had remarkably few crises during the last century. We can think of basically only two deep depressions, deep recessions in Colombia, one in 1999, the other one last year in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. In 1999, we didn't have the social protection system that we have today. And what we saw was that in response to the fall in GDP of nearly 5%, 4.5%, most vulnerable households reduced their intake of food, their consumption of basic needs. They reduced, they affected the nutrition of their kids, of girls and boys, and this had long-lasting effects. So we wanted to prevent this at all costs. We set out to first estimate what would happen due to the restrictions on mobility, on economic activity due to the pandemic. And we found that in the absence of any significant response, poverty rates could increase by 10 percentage points. This was a big alarm that set in motion the efforts of the government to create several non-conditional cash transfer programs to complement our existing social safety net.
Thank you so much. And how have they influenced the government's current thinking about social contract and investment in social welfare? What do you find especially difficult in transforming social protection systems in Colombia? What lessons might there be for other countries looking at your very experience?
Great. Okay, so social protection system in Colombia. Let's recall that the social protection system was born out of our last crisis. It was created by law in 2002. It has three big pillars. One is the social security system for access to universal health care. The second group of programs seek to stimulate social mobility, to increase social mobility through generation of skills, capacities, promoting the investments in productive inclusion. And the final component is our social promotion system, which includes all these cash transfer programs. So what we found last year when the COVID pandemic broke out was that a lot of the objectives that we had in our national development plan, which is our plan, our 4-year plan for the current government, were well conceived, but they had to be accelerated. One of the visions, one of the philosophies behind the National Development Plan was to articulate social policy with productive policies, right? So we wanted to articulate social inclusion policies with productive inclusion policies. We wanted to think about how to help households transition from social protection systems, from cash transfers, towards employment, towards productive inclusion, towards income generation, right? And this meant articulating, in particular, active labor market policies with our whole social protection system. Last year, so this led to two things, basically. One was to launch a task force for labor market reforms. This task force is led by Santiago Levy, who worked at the IADB for many years. He's an expert in labor markets, and he is leading a team of young researchers, mainly from Colombia, who have studied and are studying three main topics in labor markets: the interaction between social protection systems and labor markets, and all the skill formation programs. So how to breach that gap between that skill gap between the demand for skills and the supply of skills that affect that possibility of employment, especially for young, especially for vulnerable households. So we launched the task force that will be submitting its recommendations to government this year, very soon. And we accelerated all our efforts to transform and modernize social protection systems. Social protection systems, as I just told you, were expanded significantly through Ingreso Solidario, the non-conditional cash transfer programs. And this was based on our master database. And the master database is the cornerstone of a new national registry. So the National Registry for Social Programs will be an interoperable database where we have, on the one side, our population data, the CISBEN that I told you about, that collects all of this socioeconomic information from households and allows us to rank households according to their economic and social conditions. And on the other hand, it will operate with all the supply side of the social protection system. So we will have all the administrative records, administrative registries of the social programs, of investments as well, to match and to be able to monitor, to study, to track all these disbursements and understand what their real impact is on each of these households. It will also allow us to have a panel database where we can track households in time. The social registry was in our national development plan. We created it in the midst of the emergency, of the social emergency, to be able to create Ingreso Solidario. But this year, we really want to consolidate this effort and to move forwards towards a system that recognizes the interactions, the synergies between the different programs. Right now, we have a set of programs that have different goals, different target populations, that have different quantities of the transfers. But what we seek to do right now is really to understand how all these things interact, how labor markets interact with the social protection system, how each of these programs interact between them, the type of incentives that they create, the type of disincentives that they create. And of course, the non-conditional cash transfers opened the door to consider and to think about a form of basic income, right? Basic income is one of the big global discussions, I think, and in Colombia is not absent from that discussion. Basically, Ingreso Solidario is a form of basic income. We can discuss about the level, the amount of the cash transfer, and if that is appropriate or not, if it should be expanded or not, in terms of both the number of households and also the amount that they get. But we actually created a basic income through Ingreso Solidario, where we cover the poorest households and they receive, with no conditions, these $45 a month. So that opened the door to discuss that, and it opens, especially, I think that it created the capabilities in government, and it showed that we actually have the capabilities to operationalize these type of programs.
So let me turn to Martin. Martin, you wrote a book about who owns poverty. The title itself provokes many questions. What is poverty and who owns it? Can you share with us a few examples from your work on the poverty spotlight that practically manifest the main thesis from your book?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in this extraordinary year, and really a ripe time to rethink everything we know about development. Poverty was defined as lack of money. And we have learned with the International Labor Organization when they came up with the basic human needs, and with UNDP when the UNDP came with the Human Development Index, that poverty is more than lack of money. But now we live in the fourth industrial revolution, and technology has changed everything. So now we no longer have any excuse to consult in real time with people living in poverty. What is their perspective? Up to now, we have thought that it was the responsibility of society, that it was the responsibility of the government and of international development organizations like UNDP to formulate a strategy to overcome poverty. Even the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals were constructed by experts. But there are two types of experts. There are two types of decision makers in development in general and in poverty in particular. Decision makers at the top and decision makers at the household level. The mom, the super mother, she is the big decision makers on whether the children brush their teeth, on whether the children are vaccinated, or whether the children have a place to do their homework, of whether they will finish school or hang out with the wrong crowd and with bad friends. So there are decision makers in the Ministry of Health who promote proper nutrition. But there's also the head of the household, and I repeat, usually a super mom, a super mother, who is a big decision maker. So we should understand that perspective is rationality, and we should listen to the voices of the people at the bottom of the pyramid. We should also count the population of the world differently. The world does not have 7 billion people. The world has 1.5 billion family households. For people to overcome poverty and to reach development, you have to take in consideration the basic unit of society, which is the family household. You cannot get a child out of poverty if her mother is chronically unemployed, and you cannot get a worker out of poverty if his children are not vaccinated. It's the family unit. And of course we can, and human beings do not live independently as 7 billion units. We have to recover the role of the family. And here, there are many types of families, but people who eat and sleep under the same roof, that's what we would consider a family household.
Thank you so much. Your work definitely points to a need for a multifaceted, multidimensional approach to addressing deprivations and poverty, where, for example, the ability to manage one's emotions is as important as one's access to clean water. It challenges what it means to be an expert on poverty and points to equal merit of the person experiencing it, as well as the person studying or building policy to address it. From your experience, what will it take to transform the way we tackle poverty?
Well, as I say, we need to use a simple phone device to allow people to, just looking at images, measure their own poverty. And we should move away from an exclusivity of using indexes. Indexes aggregate data for decision makers at the top. But we need to have what I'm going to show you here, which is a dashboard where a person, any person in the world, can indicate where they are yellow, poor, where they are red, ultra poor, and where they are green. So we should move to a family dashboard, and we should also move to a family development plan. What are my priorities? Why I don't have it? What am I going to do to have it? By what time? We started with national development plans. Then we moved to state and regional development plans. Then we moved to municipal development plans. I developed the municipal plan for Asunción, Paraguay. Now we have technology to have one family development plan per every family in the globe. We can very easily have 1.5 billion family plans. And why do we know we can do that? Because everybody has Facebook, everybody has cell phones. So why is it easy to provide cell phones to the population of the world and not software and technology to allow them to self-diagnose, develop a dashboard, develop a plan, and also develop an inventory of proven solutions and strategy. There is a way in northern Nigeria to access wheelchairs. How do we know that? Because there are people in northern Nigeria who are very poor and who have wheelchairs. There is a way to live in a family-free, violence-free home in a slum in Brazil. How do we know that? Because there are places in the slums that are very peaceful. So I am very encouraged that the fourth industrial revolution and that is being proposed by the World Economic Forum and the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship can bring the power of technology for decision makers at the household level and completely change the way we have been thinking about constructing the Sustainable Development Goals. Because you know what? Between you and me, nobody understands the Sustainable Development Goals because they are too abstract. What does it mean, habitat? Is it, do we sleep in the same bedroom, or do children sleep separate from the parents? Do we have a proper bathroom? Do we have a refrigerator? Do we have furniture? So let's disaggregate these development indicators and let's personalize them. And like in first person, you know, I know my rights. I know how to petition authorities. I take care of my family. And so with that, we bring it home and we incorporate billions of people into the fight to eliminate poverty in the world in the short term. Short term, 5 years. There is nothing in poverty that cannot be addressed short term if you disaggregate it and put it from the family perspective. We have the methodology to increase family incomes. We have the methodology to promote savings. We have the methodology to educate a 10-year-old girl from South Africa. We have everything. All the solutions are already there. The only problem is that they are not in one place. And of course, you can have that inventory of solutions in the cell phone, but nobody can do it alone. So we have to develop a mentorship program, a support system to accompany the homeless living in Southern California, the formerly incarcerated African Americans in New Orleans, the people living in the demilitarized areas of Colombia, the young Armenians who are trying to develop their own micro enterprise, or the street vendors in India. I am very encouraged that we have the solutions if we are a little bit more humble and realize that in New York or in London, we will only have 50% of the solutions. The other 50% of the solutions are not only in the governments of the global South, but also at the head of the household. And by the way, there are people in France, there are people in the United States or in Germany who are maybe poorer in some areas than other people living in southern Italy or in Venezuela. So it depends on who owns poverty. That's why I wrote this book, Who Owns Poverty, that explains that It depends on whose perspective you're talking. It is very beautiful to allow the perspective of the homeless person in Los Angeles. What does she think? And so, as I say, we have the technology to make this happen.
And finally, Martin, your work also showed that changing the unit of analysis from individuals to households changes both what we see, where and how to intervene, and how the relations in the community change. Can you give us some examples of how this plays out? Ideally, some examples from private sector companies as well that work with Poverty Spotlight.
Many times governments think that the country is comprised of people. Yes, we are people, but we are individuals and part of a collective at the same time. Everybody is unique and part of a group, and that basic group is the family household. People who live and eat and sleep under the same roof. Changing that perspective makes development much easier. Take the United Nations. They have an agency for children. No, yeah, beautiful. But what does that statistic on children mean? Where are the mothers? Where are the fathers? So it has to for the work with children to be sustainable, you need to incorporate the whole family unit, and it is not that difficult. So there are many units of analysis. For example, we are working on with more than 140 corporations to do a capitalism without poverty. In this specific cases, business without poverty. And we have companies who have committed to zero poverty with other workers. And talking to these employers, initially we were afraid, because we said, if we found out that our workers were living in poverty, we thought that it was going to be our responsibility to do something about it and increase their salary. But it happens the other way around. The workers and their families get their act together, make their plan, and of course the company can help them. So we have more and more private sector companies in Paraguay, in South Africa, in the UK. We're talking to many companies in the United States, in Argentina, who are thinking about business without poverty. And the World Economic Forum is talking about stakeholder capitalism. And we say, yeah, stakeholder capitalism without poverty. And poverty is if you disaggregate it and you make it into small pieces that are understandable by the mother of the house, there are very few things that cannot be accomplished. Second, we're working also with the church, a Catholic church, in parish without poverty. Because one thing is to love the poor and to have a preferential option for the poor, but we need to empower the poor to graduate from poverty. That's why we're also working with the food banks. We're here in Paraguay, we're working with food banks. When people come to the soup kitchen and they take the food, at that moment, it's a beautiful opportunity to ask the woman, excuse me, do you have 5 minutes so that we can work on your plan to graduate from the food bank? Why are you coming to the food line? Is it a lack of employment? Is it a problem of family violence? Is it a problem of COVID? Because depending on why the person goes to the food bank, we can find a different solution. So I think that we can have a more integral approach. I think that we can work with agency and self-efficacy and empower people to, yes, we can.
So much of what we heard today is about tailoring and adapting our responses to peoples and places. There clearly is no universal recipe for change. However, sitting right beside adaptive strategies are disruptive strategies. How to change behaviors in Paraguay, how to build political coalitions in Freetown, how to envision a future that signals planetary and social boundaries, and how to pull all of this together in policy, programmatic, and institutional responses in Colombia. While most of our development attention focuses on the present, and rightly so, we should be mindful that the future is already here, but perhaps not evenly distributed. That is, we can see glimpses of the future in pockets of change and disruption, but we need to keep an eye out for tipping points and systemic change. I'd like to conclude by thanking all of our speakers for their forward-looking and inspiring work for creating insights into alternative development models. This is how change happens. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A.